My topic today is saving and storing seed. And I'm going to concentrate mostly on vegetable seed. You can save flower seed and other kinds of seeds as well, but the principles aren't much different. But the thing about vegetable seeds is we have a really important objective when we save vegetable seed, and that is to conserve the quality and positive attributes of the cultivars for which we are trying to save and store the seed. Some crops, that's fairly easy. For some crops, that can be very, very difficult. I'm going to give you some ideas of the complexities you face if you want to do this, and some of the general principles of how to accomplish what you want to accomplish, and then encourage you to try it. Even though it's complicated, it's really fun and really interesting. So what are the advantages of saving your own seed? Reduce the seed costs, maintain rare varieties, ensure seed quality. Sometimes in this really hectic vegetable growing world we have right now, where so many people are getting into it, and the seed companies are having a hard time keeping up with the demand, sometimes they accept poor quality seed so that they have something that they can give people. And again, one of the objectives of saving your own seed is to maintain the integrity of the genetics, maintain that quality, to maintain the good traits that we like in the things that we grow. So what are the problems associated with saving your own seed? Well, let's look at some of them. So pollination and pollen movement. The other is genetics, hybrids and heterozygosity. Y'all know what a hybrid is, right? It's an F1 first generation cross between two different parents, sometimes parents with very different characteristics. And because it's the first generation, then you have half of the genes coming from the female parent, half of the genes coming from the male parent. And in that first generation, every plant is exactly the same, because all of the genes came from the same place. But after that, if you tried to save your own seed from a hybrid in its F2, F3, F4 generations, the generations subsequent, and then the genes start mixing up, and you'll get a lot of variability in it. Some will look like the female parent, some will look like the male parent, and you'll have all these things in between. And so sometimes it doesn't work well to take an F1 hybrid and try to conserve the seed of it. It doesn't mean you can't do it, and it doesn't mean you'll have something that you can't use. It just means you'll have a lot of variability, and some of that variability may not be as useful. Okay, and then finally, growth habit. Some plants don't produce seed the first year. For example, if you grow table beets in your garden, have you ever seen table beets go to seed? And you might say yes, because sometimes you get a bolted plant that goes to seed early. But generally what has to happen is those roots will grow the first year with the leaves. And then the second year, those roots will provide energy to go to produce a seed stalk and work the flower. And so it takes 2 years for a seed production in something like table beets. And that becomes a real complicated issue, especially in an environment like ours, because you can't just leave the beets in the garden and let them come up and go to seed the next year, because they will freeze and it will damage and kill them during our winter months. You can do it, but it's a much, much more complicated process. Okay, so how do flower structure, pollination patterns, and growth habit influence seed saving? Well, let's take an example. Here we have a tomato. A tomato has a perfect flower. What does a perfect flower mean? It means it has both the male and the female parts. So you've got the male parts are the yellow column of pollen sacs that are formed around the center of the plant, forms a cone. Now the female part actually emerges from the middle of that cone on the tip, and as it does, the pollen will shed and actually pollinate that flower with its own pollen. So it's self-pollinated, okay? Now, if you have a perfect flower that is self-pollinated and you don't have an F1 hybrid, you have a homozygous heritage type variety, then tomato seeds will always breed true to type. They will always come back looking like the same variety that you originally planted. Okay, so with a crop like this, very easy. Tomatoes are one thing that it's very easy to conserve your variety and collect good quality seed. But how about something like broccoli? Okay, you don't harvest your heads of broccoli, they will eventually flower and they will be pollinated. However, they are insect pollinated. They have a perfect flower, and so they have male and female parts on the flower, but they don't necessarily by default pollinate themselves. And so sometimes the pollen can come from outside. And if you have insects pollinating your plants, then they will bring pollen from wherever, whoever's garden, wherever they came from, into your garden. And if they have another broccoli variety, or even like some other cole crops, which will cross with like cabbage and cauliflower and kale and those kinds of things, can actually sometimes cross with broccoli. And so if they bring pollen from those kinds of other varieties or other species, not species, but they're actually botanical varieties, other botanical varieties of the same species. That's why they intercross sometimes. But some of these other crops, then you don't really have good control over where the pollen comes from, and you can have some contamination, if you will, that may show up the next year when you replant that seed. Okay, so here's one that's not quite as easy. Okay, and something like lettuce, a perfect flower and wind pollinated. And wind pollinated, you even have less control, and pollen can come from even greater distances. Okay, and so the same thing, you may only have one cultivar in your garden, but you might have 6 gardens around you, and they will have other things in their garden. And if they go to seed at the same time yours goes, or goes to flower at the same time yours goes to flower, and they catch a few stray pollen grains, then you can lose the integrity of your variety. Something like watermelons, and in fact, this is true of all the vine crops that belong in the cucurbit family, pumpkins and squashes and melons and cucumbers and so forth. They all have monoecious flowers. Okay, and so what that means is each flower has only one sex. So you have female flowers, and you see in the bottom left here a flower that actually has a little. This is a watermelon flower that actually has a little tiny watermelon on it when the flower opens and is ready to be pollinated. But you'll also notice that there are a bunch of flowers on the plant at the same time that look like this. No little watermelon under the bottom, just a stem. And that's a male flower, and it'll have anthers in here, and this will have a kind of a curled up, almost brain-like looking pistil in the female flower. Okay, but in order to pollinate, in order for it to grow seed, pollen has to come from some of those male flowers and be transferred to the female flower. And insects happen to do most of the pollination in melons and in the cucurbits in general. But again, here you have a situation where if you have an isolated plant that's far away from any other watermelon plants or any other watermelon varieties, then you can hold your variety true to type, because all of the pollen that's available will come from the plants that you have. But if there are any other varieties around you in other gardens, then you don't have control of it anymore. You don't know where the pollen comes from. Most of it will come, the closer you are, the more of the pollen will come from those plants. But if you have another garden over the fence 30 feet away, that's close enough that you can have a lot of pollen transfer. Okay, and then Swiss chard. Swiss chard is actually the same species as beets. In fact, they're just table beets that don't have a pollen root. And so they also, and if you plant Swiss chard, where's the flower on Swiss chard? You ever seen flower on Swiss chard? How do you collect the seed? Well, it's the same thing. They're a 2-year plant. They grow the foliage the first year, they grow an inflorescence flowers and seeds the second year. And they have to have a vernalization period in between. In other words, they need to hold and at least have the impression that they've gone through a winter. And so they're growing the seed the second year. And you can, again, Chard, you can produce seed if you would like, but it's a complicated process. But which vegetables are easy for saving seed and which are hard? So let's go into some that are easy, some that are kind of easy, and some that are more difficult. The easy crops, and these are all plants that self-pollinate. So it doesn't matter what's around them. It doesn't even matter if in your own garden you have 4 varieties of beans, 7 varieties of tomatoes, 2 varieties of peppers. It doesn't matter because the pollen comes from the same plant that is being pollinated. And so there's no intercrossing of the pollen. Selfing mechanism that creates a situation that you don't have to worry about trying to control pollen sources. So beans and peas, tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants. So the legumes and the solanaceae crops. Those are almost all are self-pollinated. So with something like beans, just leave a few seed pods on your plants after you've harvested and let them go ahead and go through the rest of the season and senesce and dry out, and then go out, but go out before it rains, because if it rains, the pods crack open very quickly, scatter the seed all over. But go out and collect all the dry pods and put them in a bag, and you can store them like that. But at some point, you'll need to clean them by threshing out the seeds and then blowing out the chaff that from the broken up pods. And this is true of any seed that you collect. You need to get rid of the chaff. Don't store them dirty. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, sometimes the chaff will hold moisture, which you don't want. And then sometimes the chaff will hold diseases and other things that will infest the seed over time, or even sometimes they will hold eggs of insects that will damage the seed in storing. And so you want to get rid of everything but just the clean seed before you're done. Tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants, of course, they're a little more difficult in that they are in fruits, and the fruits are wet, but just kind of crush them. I always just stick them in a bucket of water. Sometimes I put a little bit of yeast in there because it helps them ferment a little faster. I'll let them ferment for a day or two, and then the seeds tend to be able to fall out, and you can kind of strain them out. Okay, some harder crops. Cucumber, squash, cantaloupes, watermelons. These are the ones that have both male and female flowers. And the best way to handle it, like for example, I've got an old cultivar of winter squash. They have a very long storage life and a very wonderful flavor. And so it's a heritage variety, and nobody sells the seed anymore. So I always collect my own seed. And one of the things that you can do is take a paper bag, take a couple of paper bags and put it over one of the flowers, the female flowers that looks like it's ready to open the next day, and then a male flower that's ready to open the next day. And go out maybe mid-morning the next morning, pull off the bags, pick off the flower from the male, and then just take it and rub all the pollen on the female, and then recover it. Now, by doing that, you have controlled your source of pollen, okay? And then just let that develop and mark it, put a ribbon around the stem or something, so you know that's your melon, or that's your melon or squash that has been self-pollinated, and it will be your seed source for the coming years. Okay, and anytime you start getting short on seed, you can just go out and do that on one of the flowers. Broccoli, cauliflower, you really need to isolate them from similar crops, and that's a little more difficult, especially if you have close neighbors. But one of the things that you can do is if you don't have neighbors that are too close, just make sure that you only plant one cultivar, one variety of something that you want to save the seed for. And then by doing that, virtually all, or at least most of your pollen will come from within your own crop. insect pollinated crops, you really need to be isolated at least 50 feet and maybe 100 feet. 100 feet would be better. Any distance is better. If it's a seed grower growing the crop, they would have them isolated even further than that. But you can get by with something a little less than what seed growers have to do. But then something like lettuce, radish, spinach, where you have wind pollinated crops, then you need to same thing. You need to isolate them if you can. Grow one cultivar, want to save seed of that species, and try to get them as far away as you can from any neighboring plants with different. Okay, very difficult crops: beets, Swiss chard, cabbage, carrots, onions, turnips. Okay, and again, why these? It's because they're biennials. Okay, so again, you need to isolate them. So you need to get them away from other cultivars so that you don't have pollen spread to them. But at the end of the year, all you will have is just the plant, and you can't really let it go through the winter here to get to the second year for seed production. So what you have to do is harvest it. And with the cabbage, for example, that's the most difficult. You would actually have to dig up all the roots, put them in some kind of a bag that would contain the humidity, and then keep them as cold as you can without freezing them in your crisper or in a second refrigerator or something, and hold them over the winter, and then go back out and plant them. And beets and Swiss chard, carrots, onions, turnips, you do the same thing, but you actually harvest the root or the bulb and then put it in cold storage, and then take it out and replant it in the spring, and then it will the next year, instead of growing a crop, it'll go to seed and produce seed. It's messy, it's difficult, but if you're trying to save a heritage variety or trying to prepare yourself for situations when you may not have seed available in the future, then it's worth trying to figure it out and at least try it. Okay, then there's the crops that are nigh to impossible. And one of the things that I would say as nigh to impossible that I didn't even put on the list is just a general statement I made about F1 hybrids. I just don't recommend saving seed from F1 hybrids. However, if you want to take the time, you can dehybridize F1 hybrid, and you do that by planting the seed that comes from that F1 hybrid, and that becomes the second generation or F2 seed, and it will have a lot of variability in it, and eliminate all of the plants that don't look like what you want. Only save seed from the others, and then go through several years of cycles of that, and you'll slowly kind of merge all of those variability into something that's where the plants are mostly similar. And so you can do it. It's not an impossible process. It's just it just takes time, and you have to put the effort in. Okay, and corn is a hybrid. They're all F1 or F2 hybrids, and so you can't save seed from our hybrid corns and have any chance of having a uniform variety or cultivar. There are, however, some heritage cultivars of corn that grow pretty well, and with those, again, with some isolation, you can save seed of those successfully. Now we have a series of other plants here that are all vegetatively propagated: potatoes, asparagus, garlic, chives, rhubarb. These are it's actually very easy to save your propagules. Just, if you grow potatoes, save your potatoes for the next year. If you have some asparagus, save some of your roots and plant them in a different place. If you have garlic, chives, take your bulbs and save them. Rhubarb, same thing. Take a part of the crown. But the problem with all of these are they tend to accumulate diseases. And so you can harvest seed, not of potatoes, but of something like asparagus, garlic, chives, or rhubarb, but it will not breed true at all because they are very heterozygous. One plant has genes from multiple sources, and you'll get all that variability coming out in the next generation. And so That's one of the reasons why we propagate them vegetatively, so that they remain true to type. But they accumulate diseases when you grow them over and over and go over and year after year after year. So for most of these, and garlic and chives don't accumulate as much diseases as the other, and they're easier to handle through this process. But especially potatoes, asparagus, and rhubarb, it's just better to go back to known disease-free seed sorts every time you want to replant. So they're much more difficult to maintain. I went to a heritage garden at, remember, John Adams, I think it was John Adams' house back in Virginia. And they had a heritage cultivar of potatoes, and that they were growing there, and they were the most ugly, puny potatoes. And we asked them, we said, how do you grow these? And they says, oh, we just plant them again year after year. And we could stand there and identify 4 diseases, virus diseases that had accumulated in those plants on almost every plant. And they were like a quarter the size, and probably grew potatoes the size of an egg, maybe, not even that big. But they were so sick that they just couldn't produce anymore. And they didn't even realize that they were sick. They just thought it was a variety that all and ugly and grew little potatoes. Okay, let's move on from that and talk about what is the best way to store seed. So first of all, I mentioned this already, get your seed clean so that it doesn't bring anything into storage with it. And then you want to store it cool and dry. And there's what we call the rule of 90. If you take the temperature at which they're stored at and add the relative humidity at which it's stored at, it should be 90 or less. So if you're storing it at room temperature at about 70, then you need to get that seed at a relative humidity of about 20% or less, which in the house in the summer is very difficult. So you need to store them in a container where you can control the humidity. How long can seed be saved? Well, it depends on what crop you're talking about. 1 year for sweet corn, leek, onion, and parsnips. Sometimes you can get the seed to grow a second year. Sometimes you can't. 2 to 3 years, beans, carrots, and peas. So 4 to 5 years, whole crops, lettuce, spinach, tomatoes, peppers, all the vine crops. Sometimes even you can get by, if you have good storage conditions, even 2 or 3 years longer than that. You have to know the crop to know how long you can safely store. So one of the last things I wanted to say is with storing seed, often it's best to store your seed in the refrigerator. But again, inside of a refrigerator is quite humid. And so always store your seed in some kind of a container that you can completely seal. It might be just something as simple as a quart jar that has a rubber seal, and just tighten it. And then you can put those little gel packs in it that absorb the humidity. Or what I do is I put all of my seed in one big Tupperware-like container, and I throw a bag of rice in a loose open cloth bag, a bag of rice in there, and that absorbs the moisture. And I'm able to my seed quite well. So anyway, there's a couple little tricks. You also can put them in the freezer. The freezer usually will actually extend the storage life even more than the refrigerator, but it won't make seeds last forever. Sometimes even you can get by, if you have good storage conditions, even 2 or 3 years longer than that. So homegrown, it can't be beat. Here's some additional information. There's a guide by the University of Minnesota. That's the top one for beginners that want to just learn general principles. For advanced, there's a group called the Seed Alliance, and they have a seed saving guide that has very, very detailed information on how to do things. And they have crop by crop explanations of how you deal with the seed saving for that particular crop. And then there's a book, The Complete Guide for Saving Seeds by Robert Gough. It also has very complete descriptions of general principles and crop by crop explanations of how to do things. Let me just say in general that flower seed, all the things that we've said about vegetable seeds, goes for flowered seeds, most of them have problems with pollen movement and trying to keep them true to type. However, sometimes we don't really care about that with flowers. And so sometimes it works just as well as anything else to just let them dry on the plant, go out and collect a bag full and use them to plant our flowers the next year. And flowers, most flowers don't tend to have fruits associated with them. And so you don't have to deal with the moisture, water content that a lot of our vegetables have. And so in many cases, flowers are easy. And I would recommend that even if you don't do vegetables, collect some of your flower seeds. It's very easy to collect things like zinnias and other things and chrysanthemums and other things that we like to grow, and you can save a lot of money on. The other thing that I didn't mention is one of the other things that you need to do is very, very carefully label all seed.